The quickest way to reveal a person's ignorance is not by what they do not know, but by who they choose to underestimate. On a crisp autumn evening in Manhattan, the chandeliers inside Le Jardin Royal bathed the elegant dining room in warm golden light, while crystal glasses sparkled beneath conversations worth millions of dollars. Venture capitalists celebrated another successful acquisition. Attorneys discussed mergers over expensive wine. Politicians exchanged careful smiles with influential donors. Every table reflected privilege, reputation, and power. Near the center of the room sat William Carter, a billionaire entrepreneur whose financial empire stretched across the country. His tailored charcoal suit looked as flawless as his calm reputation, and unlike many wealthy men in the room, he rarely sought attention. Across from him sat his wife, Victoria Carter, whose confidence entered every room before she did. Diamonds shimmered softly against her black evening dress as she studied the menu with visible impatience. She expected perfection from everyone around her, especially those serving her. Claire Sullivan approached their table carrying a polished leather menu and a welcoming smile. At 30 years old, she moved with quiet confidence born from years of discipline rather than years of comfort. Her white blouse was perfectly pressed beneath a simple black apron, and her blonde hair rested neatly in a low bun. Nothing about her appearance suggested wealth or status. She looked exactly like every hardworking waitress beginning another busy dinner service. "Good evening," Claire said warmly. "May I introduce tonight's chef's special?" Victoria barely looked up. "One moment." She continued scanning the menu before suddenly stopping. A faint smile appeared on her face. It was not a kind smile. It was the expression of someone who had just discovered an opportunity to entertain herself. She pointed toward a short paragraph printed beneath one of the imported French wines. "Would you read this aloud for me?" Claire lowered her eyes politely toward the menu. "Of course, ma'am." Before Claire could begin, Victoria laughed softly and leaned back in her chair. "Actually, never mind." She glanced around just enough for nearby tables to notice her amusement. "I almost forgot." William slowly looked up from the business message on his phone. "Forgot what?" Victoria smiled even wider. "That expecting a waitress to read something complicated is probably asking too much." A few nearby guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. One gentleman quietly lowered his fork. Another couple stopped their conversation without realizing it. Claire remained perfectly still, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the menu. Victoria continued with a playful tone that carried farther than she intended. "She is probably illiterate anyway." The words settled across the dining room like unexpected silence. No one laughed. Even the pianist in the corner seemed quieter for a brief moment. William looked toward his wife, surprised by the remark, but said nothing. Claire lifted her eyes slowly. There was no anger in her expression, no embarrassment, no desire to defend herself, only calm. "If it would make your evening easier," she said gently, "I would be happy to read any part of the menu you would like." Victoria blinked once, almost disappointed that the insult had failed to provoke a reaction. "You are not offended?" Claire offered a small smile. "My responsibility is to help you enjoy your dinner, not to argue." William studied the waitress for the first time since she had approached the table. There was something unusual about her composure. Most people responded to humiliation with frustration, silence, or resentment. Claire displayed none of those emotions. Victoria tapped one perfectly manicured finger against the menu. "Very well," she said. "Read the French description under the Bordeaux selection." Claire nodded respectfully. She glanced at the page for only a moment before beginning to read the passage with smooth pronunciation and effortless rhythm. Her voice was clear, measured, and elegant, as though every syllable belonged exactly where it landed. Several guests quietly looked up from their meals. William slowly placed his phone on the table. Victoria's confident smile faded ever so slightly as she realized the evening was no longer unfolding the way she had imagined. Claire finished reading the French description with effortless precision, her pronunciation flowing naturally enough that even a guest from the neighboring table quietly lifted his head in surprise. The final sentence faded into the warm air of the dining room, and for a brief moment nobody spoke. Victoria stared at the menu in front of her as though it had somehow betrayed her. She had expected hesitation, confusion, perhaps an awkward apology. Instead, The young waitress had read every word with the confidence of someone completely at home with the language. Claire gently closed the menu and placed it back on the table. "Would you like me to recommend a pairing for the Bordeaux as well, ma'am?" she asked with the same calm professionalism she had shown from the beginning. Victoria forced a small smile that never reached her eyes. "You memorized that, did not you?" Claire shook her head politely. "No, ma'am." "Then perhaps you simply got lucky." William quietly watched the exchange without interrupting. Earlier he had dismissed the conversation as another one of his wife's impulsive remarks, but now something about Claire's composure held his attention. She neither defended herself nor attempted to prove a point. She simply continued doing her job. Around the dining room, several guests returned to their meals, although many continued listening from a distance. Curiosity had quietly replaced discomfort. Victoria folded her hands together. "Very well," she said. "If you truly understand French, perhaps you can explain the phrase beneath the chef's seasonal tasting menu." She turned the menu toward Claire, pointing to a handwritten note printed in elegant script. Claire glanced down for only a second before answering. The chef is describing a preparation inspired by traditional Provençal cooking. The phrase means the ingredients should speak for themselves rather than being hidden beneath heavy seasoning. A gentleman seated nearby smiled almost instinctively. His wife leaned closer and whispered, "That is exactly what it means." Victoria heard the comment and pressed her lips together. "Interesting," she replied. "You certainly know how to sound convincing." Claire remained perfectly composed. "Would you like me to explain the dish in English as well?" "No." Victoria's answer came more quickly than she intended. William finally placed his folded napkin beside his plate. "Victoria," he said quietly, "I think she has answered your questions." His tone was gentle, but there was unmistakable meaning behind it. Victoria looked toward her husband with mild surprise. He rarely challenged her publicly, even over something small. "I am only trying to understand who is serving our dinner," she replied. William nodded once. "And I believe she has been more than patient." Claire offered both of them a courteous smile. "There is no problem at all, sir. Questions are part of hospitality." Her answer caused William to look at her more carefully. There was no trace of sarcasm, no attempt to embarrass his wife. She had just been insulted in front of an entire restaurant, yet she continued treating both guests with identical respect. The restaurant manager passed nearby and quietly asked Claire whether another table needed assistance. "I will be there in just a moment," she answered before turning back toward the Carters. "Would you like a few more minutes with the menu?" William nodded. "Yes, thank you." Claire inclined her head politely and walked toward another section of the dining room. As she passed several tables, guests greeted her with warm smiles. An elderly couple thanked her for remembering their usual dessert. A young family asked for another basket of bread, and Claire laughed softly with the little boy who proudly showed her a drawing he had colored while waiting for dinner. Every interaction appeared genuine, effortless, and familiar. William noticed every detail. "She seems to know everyone," he observed. Victoria shrugged dismissively. "That is called customer service." William continued watching as Claire gently helped an older guest adjust his chair before returning a forgotten reading glass with quiet kindness. None of those moments looked rehearsed. None seemed performed for attention. They reflected habit rather than strategy. Victoria followed his gaze, then looked back toward her untouched menu. For reasons she could not explain, the confidence she had carried into the restaurant no longer felt as solid as it had only minutes earlier. While across the room, Claire continued serving every table exactly the same way, completely unaware that the evening had only begun to reveal who she truly was. William remained unusually quiet after Claire walked away, his eyes following her as she moved gracefully between tables with the same steady composure she had shown only moments earlier. She greeted every guest with genuine warmth, remembered regular customers by name, and anticipated small needs before anyone asked. A gentleman reached for his reading glasses only to discover they had slipped beneath the table, and before he could stand, Claire calmly retrieved them with a smile. At another table, she noticed a young mother struggling to keep her toddler entertained while waiting for dinner. Claire quietly brought the child a small coloring sheet and a handful of crayons from the hostess stand. The little boy's face lit up instantly. His parents thanked her with visible relief. None of those gestures appeared rehearsed. They reflected someone who understood people rather than simply serving them. Victoria folded her menu and looked across the dining room with growing irritation. Everyone seems to adore her, she said under her breath. William glanced toward his wife. Perhaps there is a reason. Victoria gave a dismissive shrug. Being pleasant does not make someone educated. William did not answer. Instead, he watched Claire pause beside an elderly couple celebrating what appeared to be a special occasion. She listened carefully before laughing softly at something the husband said, then disappeared briefly into the kitchen. A few minutes later, she returned carrying a small dessert decorated with a single candle. The elderly woman covered her mouth with both hands, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. Nearby diners quietly applauded as the couple smiled at one another. Claire accepted none of the attention. She simply wished them a happy anniversary and continued working as though the moment belonged entirely to them. William leaned back in his chair. She notices everything. Victoria stirred her sparkling water without looking up. That is her job. No, William replied thoughtfully. Her job is taking orders. The rest is a choice. Before Victoria could respond, Claire returned carrying fresh bread and a small dish of whipped butter for their table. Your entrees will be ready in approximately 10 minutes, she said. May I refresh your water while you wait? William handed her his glass with a polite nod. Thank you. Victoria watched Claire refill each glass with careful precision. Tell me something, she said suddenly. Where did you learn French? Claire looked up with the same calm expression. I have always enjoyed learning languages, ma'am. Always? Victoria asked. How many do you speak? Claire paused only briefly. Enough to help guests feel welcome. Victoria smiled faintly. That is another clever answer. Claire returned the water pitcher to the tray. Hospitality often begins with listening before speaking. William noticed that Claire had once again answered without revealing very much about herself. There was a quiet discipline in the way she spoke, as though every word had been carefully weighed before leaving her lips. Victoria reached into her designer handbag and removed a small hardcover book she had purchased earlier that afternoon from an upscale bookstore nearby. It was an antique collection of European essays, bound in dark leather with faded gold lettering across the cover. She placed it on the table and rested one hand lightly upon it. William recognized the expression on his wife's face immediately. She had not finished. She was preparing another test. Since you enjoy languages, Victoria said pleasantly enough for several nearby diners to hear again. Perhaps you would not mind reading a passage from this instead. William slowly exhaled. Victoria. His voice carried a quiet warning. She turned toward him with innocent surprise. What? She said she enjoys languages. Claire glanced at the worn book without reaching for it. Her expression remained unchanged, peaceful and attentive. Around them, the atmosphere shifted once more. A neighboring table fell silent. The restaurant manager looked toward the dining room from across the room, sensing another unusual exchange about to unfold. Claire gently folded her hands in front of her apron and smiled. If reading it would be helpful to you, ma'am, she said softly, I would be happy to try. Victoria slowly opened the old volume to a bookmarked page, completely convinced that this time the evening would finally unfold exactly as she had planned. Claire accepted the antique volume with both hands. Treating it with the same care, she gave every plate of fine china that passed through the restaurant. The dark leather cover showed the gentle wear of many decades, and the gold lettering had faded until only fragments remained visible beneath the warm chandelier light. Victoria leaned back comfortably, convinced that the evening had finally reached the moment she had been waiting for. William watched in silence, his expression thoughtful rather than amused. Around them, conversations gradually softened once again as nearby guests sensed another unusual exchange unfolding. Claire opened the book to the marked page and quietly examined the text. It was not modern French. The passage had been written in formal 19th century French with several expressions rarely used in contemporary conversation. She read the first paragraph aloud with smooth, measured pronunciation, her voice calm and unhurried. Every sentence flowed naturally, preserving both the rhythm and elegance of the original author. The room became noticeably quieter with each line. Even guests who did not understand the language recognized confidence when they heard it. Claire reached the end of the page, gently closed the book, and returned it to Victoria with a respectful smile. Would you also like an English translation, ma'am? Victoria hesitated for the briefest moment before answering. Go ahead. Claire nodded politely. The author is reflecting on the difference between knowledge that is displayed for admiration and wisdom that quietly shapes character. He suggests that people often spend too much energy proving themselves to strangers while overlooking the values that define them in private. William's eyes lifted toward Claire almost immediately. Something about the explanation felt remarkably clear despite the complexity of the original writing. Victoria folded her arms. "That sounds like your interpretation." Claire answered gently. "Yes, ma'am. Every translation contains a measure of interpretation. Languages carry ideas as well as words." Before Victoria could respond, a distinguished older gentleman seated 2 tables away slowly stood from his chair. He had been listening quietly throughout the exchange while enjoying dinner alone. Carrying his coffee cup, he approached with a warm smile and an unmistakable European accent. "Forgive me for interrupting," he said. "I could not help overhearing." Claire turned toward him respectfully. "Good evening, sir." The gentleman inclined his head. "The translation was excellent. I taught 19th century French literature for nearly 30 years before retiring. Your explanation captured not only the vocabulary, but the author's intention." Several nearby diners exchanged surprised glances. Victoria's confident expression faltered. "You are a professor?" she asked the gentleman. He smiled modestly. "Formerly. At Columbia University." He looked back toward Claire. "It is rare to hear someone your age read that style of French so naturally." Claire offered a grateful smile. "Thank you. That is very kind of you." The professor laughed softly. "Kindness has nothing to do with it. Accuracy does." William watched the exchange with growing curiosity. Claire had not attempted to impress anyone. She had answered each challenge only after being asked, and every response remained measured, respectful, and free of pride. The retired professor returned to his table after wishing everyone a pleasant evening, leaving behind a silence far more powerful than applause. Victoria looked down at the old book resting before her. For the first time since entering the restaurant, she seemed uncertain about what to say next. William finally spoke, his voice calm and thoughtful. "Victoria, perhaps we should order dinner." She looked toward him, searching for support that no longer seemed to be there. Instead, William turned to Claire with quiet respect. "Would you recommend the chef's tasting menu?" Claire smiled warmly, as though the previous conversation had never happened. "I believe you would enjoy it very much, sir. The seasonal duck is exceptional this evening, and the chef prepared a wonderful apple tart for dessert." William nodded. "That sounds perfect." Claire wrote the order with neat, careful handwriting before excusing herself toward the kitchen. As she disappeared through the swinging doors, William remained looking after her, increasingly convinced that the most remarkable thing about Claire Sullivan was not how much she knew, but how little she seemed to care about proving it. The dining room gradually returned to its gentle rhythm after Claire disappeared through the kitchen doors, yet an invisible change had settled over Le Jardin Royal. Conversations resumed, glasses clinked softly, and the pianist continued playing familiar jazz standards. But many guests still glanced toward the entrance of the kitchen as though waiting for the quiet waitress to return. William remained unusually thoughtful. He had attended board meetings where billion-dollar decisions were made in less time than it had taken Claire to answer a few simple questions. Yet those brief conversations lingered in his mind more stubbornly than any business negotiation. Victoria, however, refused to accept that the evening had slipped beyond her control. She reached for the antique book once more, slowly turning its pages with visible determination. "There must be something she does not know," she murmured. William looked toward his wife. "Why does that matter so much?" Victoria closed the book with a soft thud. "Because people should not pretend to be something they are not." William considered her answer before replying quietly. "Have you seen her pretend to be anything?" Victoria hesitated. "No." "Then perhaps we are trying too hard to define someone we have only known for 20 minutes. Before Victoria could answer, the restaurant's front entrance opened, allowing a cool breeze from the Manhattan evening to drift briefly across the elegant dining room. An older gentleman entered, wearing a charcoal overcoat, carrying a worn leather briefcase beneath one arm. The hostess greeted him warmly before leading him toward a quiet table near the window. As he removed his coat, several guests nodded respectfully in recognition. He was clearly someone well known within the city, although William could not immediately place him. Claire emerged from the kitchen carrying two beautifully arranged dinner plates just as the gentleman settled into his chair. The moment she saw him, her expression brightened with genuine surprise. "Good evening, Professor Langford," she said warmly. The older man looked up, and an unmistakable smile spread across his face. "Claire Sullivan." He stood immediately instead of remaining seated. "What an unexpected pleasure." Claire laughed softly. "It has been far too long." William noticed something remarkable. The professor was not speaking to Claire with the polite friendliness reserved for restaurant staff. He addressed her as an equal. "You look well," Professor Langford said. "How is your father?" Claire's eyes softened. "He is much stronger this year." "Thank you for asking. That is wonderful news." The professor paused before smiling again. "I still recommend your paper to graduate students every semester." Claire lowered her eyes modestly. "You are very generous." William slowly placed his fork on the table. Victoria looked from Claire to the professor with growing uncertainty. "Do they know each other?" she whispered. William nodded almost absent-mindedly. "Apparently very well." The professor accepted his menu before quietly adding, "You know, Claire, several people from the university still ask whether you might someday return." Claire smiled gently while placing a glass of water before him. "Life has a way of changing our plans." "Perhaps," Professor Langford replied. "But remarkable minds do not disappear simply because they choose different work." Several nearby diners overheard the conversation and exchanged curious glances. Victoria's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. She remembered every confident remark she had made earlier in the evening. Each one now echoed inside her mind with increasing discomfort. Claire simply thanked the professor and excused herself to continue serving the other guests. She neither expanded upon his words nor attempted to explain them. She moved naturally to another table, refilled coffee, replaced a folded napkin, and smiled at a family celebrating a birthday. It was as though the conversation had never happened. William watched her for several moments before quietly turning back toward Professor Langford. "Excuse me," he said politely once Claire was out of earshot. "May I ask how you know Miss Sullivan?" The professor looked pleasantly surprised by the question. He glanced across the room toward Claire with unmistakable admiration before returning his attention to William. A warm smile appeared on his face as though he had just been reminded of one of the finest students he had ever known. "Know her?" he repeated softly. "Young man, if you only knew who that remarkable woman truly is, you would understand why everyone who has ever worked beside her speaks her name with such respect." William remained silent for several seconds after Professor Langford spoke. The elegant restaurant around them seemed to fade into the background as his attention settled entirely on the older gentleman sitting across the room. Victoria, who had been pretending to study the wine list, slowly lowered it onto the table. She could no longer ignore the conversation unfolding before her. "What do you mean?" William asked quietly. Professor Langford smiled with the kind of pride usually reserved for family rather than former students. "Claire Sullivan completed one of the finest graduate research projects our department has seen in many years. Her work on language, communication, and human decision-making earned recognition from universities across the country." William looked instinctively toward the kitchen doors where Claire had disappeared only moments earlier. It was difficult to reconcile the woman carrying dinner plates with the scholar Professor Langford was describing. "She never mentioned any of that," William said. "Of course she did not," the professor replied warmly. "Claire has never believed that accomplishments should be introduced before kindness." Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "If she was so successful," she asked, attempting to sound casual, "why is she working as a waitress?" Professor Langford looked at her for a long moment before answering. There was no judgment in his expression, only quiet understanding. Because life occasionally asks difficult questions that no university can answer. He folded his hands gently on the table. 3 years ago, Claire's father suffered a severe stroke. His recovery required constant care, frequent therapy, and countless medical appointments. Several prestigious academic positions would have required her to relocate across the country. Instead, she chose to remain here in New York so she could help care for him every day. Victoria lowered her eyes without realizing it. The professor continued softly. The restaurant offered flexible hours. She could work mornings or evenings, adjust her schedule around medical appointments, and still support her family. To many people, it looked like she walked away from a promising academic career. Claire never described it that way. She simply said she was choosing the people who had always chosen her. William listened without interrupting. Every sentence quietly dismantled another assumption he had made since arriving that evening. He had spent decades measuring success through financial reports, executive titles, and expanding companies. Yet the decision Professor Langford described required a kind of strength that could not be listed on any balance sheet. Does she ever plan to return to the university? William finally asked. The professor smiled. Many of us hope so. We have invited her more than once. She always says the same thing. Knowledge can wait. Family cannot. The words settled heavily between them. Victoria stared silently at the untouched antique book resting beside her plate. Earlier that evening, she had used it as a tool to embarrass someone she believed was beneath her. Now it seemed to reflect her own misunderstanding far more clearly than Claire's. Just then Claire returned carrying the Carters' dinner. The roasted duck was arranged with remarkable precision, accompanied by seasonal vegetables and a delicate apple reduction that filled the air with a warm aroma. She placed each plate carefully before the couple before turning to Professor Langford with a welcoming smile. Your herb-roasted salmon will be ready in just a few minutes, Professor. Thank you, Claire. He smiled warmly. I was just telling these nice people how proud the university still is of you. Claire looked gently amused rather than embarrassed. You have always been too generous. Not generous, he replied. Only truthful. Claire simply thanked him before returning her attention to William and Victoria. Is there anything else I may bring you this evening? William looked up at her with an expression completely different from the one he had worn at the beginning of the night. The curiosity remained, but now it was joined by genuine respect. Before he could answer, Victoria quietly reached for her water glass. Her hand paused halfway. For the first time that evening, the confident words that usually came so easily refused to appear, because she had finally begun to understand that the only person she had truly misjudged was herself. Claire noticed the unusual silence at the table, but did not assume its cause. She simply waited with the same patient expression she offered every guest, allowing them the time to finish their conversation without interruption. William looked at her for a long moment before speaking. Miss Sullivan, he said quietly, may I ask you something that has nothing to do with dinner? Claire nodded politely. If I can answer, I will be happy to. Victoria remained completely still, her eyes resting on the white tablecloth rather than meeting Claire's. William chose his words carefully. Professor Langford mentioned that universities invited you to continue your academic career. Do you ever regret saying no? Claire considered the question for several thoughtful seconds. She did not rush to answer, nor did she appear uncomfortable. Instead, she glanced toward the large windows overlooking the Manhattan streets where evening lights reflected softly across the glass. People often ask what I gave up, she said gently. Very few ask what I received. Instead, William listened closely. What did you receive? Claire smiled with quiet gratitude. Time. The single word lingered between them. When my father first came home from the rehabilitation center, he could not button his own shirt. He could not walk across the living room without assistance. Every physical therapy session required patience. Every small improvement felt like a celebration. Her eyes softened as she remembered those moments. The first morning he poured himself a cup of coffee without asking for help. We celebrated as though he had won an Olympic medal. William could not help smiling. Claire continued, her voice calm and steady. The first time he walked through Central Park without stopping every few minutes. We bought hot chocolate from a street vendor and sat on a bench for almost an hour, simply watching people pass by. Those moments never appeared on a resume, but they became the most valuable education I have ever received. Victoria slowly lifted her eyes. There was no trace of self-pity in Claire's voice. She was not asking for sympathy. She was simply sharing a truth. Did you never miss teaching? William asked. Claire nodded honestly. Of course I did. I enjoyed research. I enjoyed helping students discover ideas they never imagined they could understand. But classrooms will always exist. My father's recovery happened only once. William lowered his gaze toward his folded hands. Throughout his career, he had postponed birthdays, anniversaries, vacations, and family dinners because another meeting always seemed more important. Listening to Claire, he wondered how many irreplaceable moments he had traded for achievements that now occupied little more than framed certificates and financial reports. Professor Langford said the university still hopes you will return, he said. Claire smiled. Perhaps someday. My father has become much stronger. Last month, he drove himself to the grocery store for the first time since his stroke. I still followed him in my own car just in case, but he insisted he could manage. She laughed softly at the memory. He was very proud. William found himself laughing as well. The story felt refreshingly ordinary, yet somehow far more meaningful than the conversations he usually heard at executive dinners. Victoria finally spoke, her voice noticeably quieter than it had been earlier that evening. You never told anyone why you were here? Claire looked at her with gentle surprise. No one ever asked. The answer was simple, honest, free of accusation. Victoria's shoulders lowered almost imperceptibly. She remembered every assumption she had made within the first few minutes of meeting Claire. None of them had come from evidence. They had come from appearances alone. William looked from his wife to Claire before speaking with quiet sincerity. I have spent years believing success could be measured by titles, income, and recognition. Claire listened without interrupting. Tonight, he continued, I am beginning to think those measurements may have been incomplete. Claire's smile remained warm but modest. Life has many ways of defining success, Mr. Carter. We simply notice the definition we choose to look for. At that moment, the entire restaurant seemed to grow quieter once again, not because anyone had raised their voice, but because one simple conversation had begun changing far more than the atmosphere around a single dinner table. Claire excused herself with a polite smile and returned to the rhythm of the evening, carrying fresh plates from the kitchen and greeting new guests with the same quiet warmth she had shown from the moment her shift began. Nothing in her expression suggested that the conversations at the Carter table had affected her. She moved from one table to another with graceful efficiency, remembering a preferred dessert here, an allergy there, a child's favorite drink at another table. It was as though every guest mattered equally, regardless of what they wore or what they could afford. William watched her from across the dining room while absent-mindedly cutting into his dinner. The duck was perfectly prepared, yet he barely noticed its flavor. His thoughts remained fixed on the woman who had quietly dismantled every assumption made about her without ever attempting to defend herself. Victoria sat in unusual silence beside him. Earlier, that evening she had spoken with complete certainty. Now every confident opinion seemed to have dissolved beneath facts she could no longer ignore. She slowly placed her fork on the edge of the plate. William, she said softly, I think I owe her an apology. He looked toward his wife with quiet surprise. It was not a sentence he heard often. I think you are right, he answered gently. Victoria looked down at the antique book still resting beside her dinner plate. I called someone illiterate before learning a single thing about her. She shook her head almost imperceptibly. I have replayed those words in my mind ever since Professor Langford arrived. William reached across the table and lightly rested his hand over hers. Recognizing a mistake is the beginning of correcting it. Victoria gave a small nod, but did not immediately stand. She seemed to be searching for the right moment as much as the right words. A few minutes later, Claire returned carrying a tray with fresh coffee and dessert selections. She placed a beautifully prepared apple tart before William and a delicate vanilla souffle before Victoria. I hope you enjoy dessert, she said warmly. Before she could step away, Victoria quietly rose from her chair. Several nearby diners noticed the movement and instinctively looked toward the table once again. Victoria met Claire's eyes with genuine sincerity. Miss Sullivan, she began. Before anything else, I would like to apologize. Claire looked at her with calm attention. Earlier this evening, I judged you without knowing you. I spoke carelessly, and my words were unfair. I am truly sorry. The restaurant seemed to fall into another gentle silence. Claire did not answer immediately. She studied Victoria's expression for a brief moment, not searching for perfection, but for honesty. Finally, she smiled with the same quiet kindness that had defined the entire evening. Thank you, she said softly. It takes courage to apologize. Victoria let out a slow breath she had not realized she was holding. I do not expect you to forget what I said. Claire shook her head gently. People are more than their worst moment. We all say things we wish we could take back. William looked at Claire with growing admiration. She had been given every opportunity to embarrass the woman who had humiliated her in front of an entire dining room. Instead, she chose grace over victory. Professor Langford, watching quietly from across the room, smiled to himself before returning to his dinner. Claire turned toward William. Is there anything else I may bring either of you this evening? William smiled warmly. Only one thing. Claire waited patiently. Thank you, he said, not only for the wonderful service, but for reminding us of something much more important than dinner. Claire's expression softened. Kindness has a way of finding its way back to us, Mr. Carter. William nodded thoughtfully. As Claire walked away once more, Victoria remained standing for another moment, watching the young waitress disappear toward the kitchen. She realized that Claire had accepted her apology without demanding an explanation, without seeking recognition, and without making her feel smaller in return. Somehow that quiet generosity carried more power than any argument ever could, and for the first time in many years, Victoria understood that true education could be recognized not only by what a person knew, but by how they chose to treat another human being. The evening slowly drew to a close as the last dinner reservations faded into quiet conversations, and the warm glow of the chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors. Outside, the lights of Manhattan shimmered beneath a gentle autumn drizzle, turning every passing taxi into a ribbon of gold against the wet streets. Inside Le Jardin Royal, the pace finally slowed. Servers cleared the final tables, the pianist quietly closed his music book, and the comforting aroma of fresh coffee lingered in the air. Claire folded a clean linen napkin, thanked the kitchen staff one by one, and carefully untied her black apron before placing it inside her worn leather satchel. She completed every closing task with the same care she had shown throughout the evening, never rushing simply because the restaurant had become quiet. As she stepped toward the front entrance, William stood from his table. Victoria rose beside him. There was no audience now, no crowded dining room, and no reason to perform for anyone else. William walked toward Claire with measured steps and stopped a respectful distance away. Miss Sullivan, he said warmly, before you leave, I simply wanted to thank you. Claire smiled. You are very welcome, Mr. Carter. I hope you both enjoyed your dinner. William nodded. We enjoyed far more than dinner tonight. Victoria looked directly into Claire's eyes. The confidence that had once been sharpened by pride had become something quieter, something more honest. I have spent most of my life believing education could be recognized by titles, clothing, or social circles, she admitted. You reminded me that real education is revealed by character. Claire's expression remained gentle. We all continue learning throughout our lives. Victoria smiled faintly. Including me. William reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a simple business card. He held it for a moment before looking at Claire. Months ago, I would have offered this because I believed I could change someone else's future. He smiled thoughtfully. Tonight, I understand that my own future may have changed instead. Claire looked at the card but made no effort to take it. William noticed and quietly returned it to his pocket without embarrassment. I understand, he said. Claire nodded appreciatively. Thank you. There was no awkwardness between them. Only mutual respect. Professor Langford happened to walk past on his way toward the exit, carrying his overcoat over one arm. He smiled warmly at Claire. Still teaching, I see. Claire laughed softly. Only when life creates the classroom. The professor chuckled with quiet satisfaction before stepping into the cool Manhattan evening. William watched him disappear through the glass doors before turning back toward Claire one final time. May I ask you one last question? Claire nodded. Of course. William smiled. After everything that happened tonight, are you angry with us? Claire thought for only a moment before answering. No. William looked surprised. Not even a little? Claire gently shook her head. People often speak from the limits of what they understand. Sometimes the kindest response is not proving them wrong. Sometimes it is giving them the opportunity to grow. Silence settled peacefully between them. Victoria lowered her eyes for a brief moment before whispering. Thank you for giving me that opportunity. Claire reached for the restaurant door and smiled once more. Take good care of one another. With that, she stepped outside into the cool evening, her footsteps disappearing slowly along the rain-washed sidewalk beneath the glow of the city lights. William and Victoria remained standing inside the entrance, watching until she disappeared into the distance. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Finally, William smiled quietly and said, Tonight we came here expecting excellent service. Victoria nodded gently. Instead, we received an unforgettable lesson. Months later, employees at Carter Holdings noticed small changes. William greeted receptionists by name. He thanked maintenance staff before leaving late meetings. Victoria treated servers, drivers, and receptionists with the same courtesy she once reserved only for important clients. Neither of them ever mentioned that evening publicly. They did not need to. The lesson remained with them long after the memory of the dinner itself had faded. Somewhere across the city, Claire continued living exactly as she always had, caring for her father, serving guests with quiet dignity, and never introducing herself by her accomplishments. She never knew how deeply one ordinary evening changed two strangers. Perhaps she never needed to know. Because the strongest wisdom rarely demands recognition, and the greatest measure of literacy is not the ability to read words upon a page, but the ability to read the humanity standing quietly before us.